Hello, everyone. It is great to have you join us today. One of the things about Zoom is that when we're sharing a PowerPoint, Laura and I can't see everyone. We can only see a select few. So if you will introduce yourself, as Ava said, and put it in the chat box, that's a great way for us to know that you're here. And then just keep in mind that as we go through this presentation, we'll be monitoring that chat box. So as you ask questions, as you share comments, we're going to do our very best to get to those at different times through the presentation. And I just want to introduce myself, and then Laura will do the same. I'm Rebecca Holland. I have recently come on board full-time at AIVRTTAC as a VR coordinator. I was a Tribal VR Program Director and Counselor at the Pueblo of Jemez in New Mexico for 14 years, and then spent a couple years in state VR. And I'm really excited to be a part of the AIVRTTAC team and providing technical assistance. So it's really good to be with you today. I know if I could see all of your faces, there would be ones that I would recognize. Laura?
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks, Ava. My name's Laura Maudsley. I work as the director of the TVR Institute at Northwest Indian College, which is in Bellingham, Washington. I also was a tribal VR counselor and director. I worked for the South Puget Intertribal Planning Agency as a counselor, and then later as the director of the North Intertribal Voc Rehab Program, which was a consortium through the Stillaguamish Tribe of Indians. And I did that for a little over 8 years. So thank you all for being here today. It's great to have you. And Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, Laura and I, if you've been in any of our webinar trainings, you will know that we like open discussion. We like to learn from each other. And so at different times in the process of presenting, we are going to make sure we stop and have discussion questions so that we can learn from each other. We also want to let you know that this PowerPoint presentation will be available on the AIVRTTAC website afterwards. You will be able to download it, and you will also be able to have a copy of that to share with other people that are in your program. So feel free to do that. We want to say up front that we encourage you to take the survey at the end of this webinar. It'll come to you by email. And one of the reasons we're saying this now is because this is really a way for us to really hear from you what works and what doesn't work in webinar trainings. And so we encourage you to take that survey. It'll come out to you by email. You know, I kind of think of it as this. When I was a tribal VR director, we would give our clients surveys to provide information to us on our project and how we were doing. And we really needed those to be able to make the correction and changes to our program. And that's the same with the surveys that AIVRTTAC sends out. So please take a few minutes. It won't take you very long, and fill those out for us if you will. We'd appreciate that. We also want to just keep in mind that honoring each other as we talk today is really important. Laura and I are not talking to you from the perspective of absolute experts on this topic. I don't think anybody ever becomes a complete expert knowing everything about counseling techniques. And so it's really an opportunity for us to learn from each other and also to respect each other. So when you make a comment, try real hard not to address another individual on the webinar with something they may have said. Just speak from your own experience and your own examples. And just realize that as we go through this, we're on a journey together. So I want to start with just throwing out the learning outcomes that we hope as a result of you going through this today, you'll be able to have at the end of our time. So Ava, if you'd advance to the learning outcomes. So by the end of this webinar, our hope is that you'll be able to describe specific counseling strategies and techniques. You'll be able to identify specific counseling approaches, and practice some of the skills, the increased counseling skills in the profession that you're in. Again, this is just going to skim the surface of this topic. And there's a lot of information out there that you'll be able to look for if you want additional information. So let's get started with an opening activity and have you share with us some thoughts you have on effective TVR counselors. So Ava, go to the slide with the opening activity. We would like for you to share one thing that you think makes an effective TVR counselor. You can do that by placing your comments in the chat box, or you can unmute and just share with us. And we ask that you make your comments brief so that everyone is able to participate. But again, what's one thing that you think makes an effective TVR counselor? And Laura, if you want to monitor the chat box, that would be great. And those of you that just want to unmute and speak up, let us know.
Well, Bettina in the chat is saying listening skills. Let's see. I think White Otter is saying motivational interviewing. Anita is saying the ability to listen and be open-minded. Elise is saying staying consistent with participants.
These are really good.
I think establishing a good rapport from the beginning is a good.
Thanks, Albert. Carmelita is saying respect. Heather is saying being empathetic and meeting the participants where they are at. Carol saying active listening. Letty typed in communication and cooperation. Dana is saying to be fully present when with participants, having compassion and understanding, be on their level. Claudia says inclusion in all decision making. And Donnell is saying empathy.
This is Jonathan. I'd like to say, I'm sorry. All of the above, plus be honest and upfront with the participants.
These are all great. In fact, you guys are hitting all the ones we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
So
Well done.
Job.
And Trisha's saying empathy and good communication.
Great.
Stephanie is adding a develop passion to help others, trust, communication, etc. And Earl is saying transparency.
That's great.
Yeah, that's huge.
So is there anybody else that wants to unmute and jump in before we move on? All right, we're going to move on. You guys did an excellent job of really hitting and targeting some of the key parts, the key factors of effective TVR counselors. So let me just share with you what Laura and I are going to be talking about today. There's several pieces and we're going to unpack these as we go along in the presentation. We're going to talk very briefly about the cultural perspective when it comes to TVR counseling and some of the things that are really important. We're going to look at characteristics of effective VR counselors, which you guys did a great job of kicking this off and getting us started with that. We're going to talk about basic counseling skills. And really, I think of this as things that we can learn to really use as we're working with participants in our programs. We're going to talk about 4 specific types of counseling, and we are not going to talk about them in depth because they could each be their own presentation. We're going to talk about person-centered counseling, motivational interviewing, which is what someone brought up as really a good effective counselor. We're going to talk briefly about cognitive behavioral counseling, and then family-centered counseling, which we all know is a really important part of the work that we do in tribal communities. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about cultural perspective. And what does that mean in regards to the work that we do? Well, this is what sets us apart from state VR and from the Veterans Administration VR program. We're able to do things from a culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive manner. And so that means there are specific things that can happen in counseling and in providing services to clients that really give a cultural perspective. The first thing to think about when working with clients is really that cultural differences exist in many different areas. You can have differences in the area of family. The communities are very different based on the tribal community that you're working with. The spirituality and the traditional healing practices can be very different. And also communication, the way that communication is done can be very different in each of the cultural communities served. The second thing is that cultural identity is unique for every single participant. During the time that I was working at the Pueblo of Jemez as the program director, there were times when clients would come in and they would want their entire case and their entire VR process to include their culture. And there were other participants that would come in that didn't want their cultural piece to be included in the process. And so every participant is different and their cultural identity is unique to that participant. The next thing is that participation in TVR may include family. And I say may include because not everyone wants their family involved, but there are many participants that want family included in the VR process for them. And that's because family is extremely important. It is to all of us, but in a Native community, family can not only be just your immediate family, it can be extended family, it can be your clan, it can be in all different areas. And many clients or participants want family included. Also in cultural perspective, self-disclosure and sharing may take time. And that's really an important piece. And I think it is with any client, any participant we're serving, is that there are some critical things that have to happen for someone to feel comfortable to open up and do self-disclosure and really share in a counseling session. And sometimes they know you because you're in the same community, you've been involved together in different things in the community. And so self-disclosure and sharing can take time, and giving participants that time is really important. And it includes things that have to do with the culture. The last thing on this slide says that every tribal culture has their own healing practices. You know, we are really aware that every TVR program across the nation has a different service area. Some of the TVR programs only serve tribal members within their tribe, but then there's other TVR programs that provide services within a scope of service. And there might be many different Native people in that scope of service that come from all different kinds of tribal communities. And so just being sensitive that just because you're a TVR program doesn't necessarily mean you understand all of the healing practices of the people participating in the program. So really being sensitive to the cultural perspective of every single participant that walks through your doors. Even if you think you know all of the aspects of a culture, there may be something very different and unique to that individual. And so understanding that from the beginning is really important. Laura, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what the point you were just making is that sometimes there will be people from other tribal communities that will be on your, that live in your community that will have different traditions or different healing practices, and that you may need to let them lead you and teach you a little bit about what they need. And it may not be specific. You may not learn the specifics of it, but they, to learn and try to help them with what would help them in their VR process. So
that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So you guys did a great job of identifying effective pieces of TVR counselors. Now we're going to talk about a few more of these, and you're going to see in the list that we've put together that a lot of the ones you talked about are ones that we've identified. And it's also important to know that this isn't a full and complete list. I mean, we could probably go on for days in what makes an effective TVR counselor, but these are really some important characteristics. And really, Laura and I want to encourage you and empower you to recognize that a lot of these things are within us. They're things that sometimes we just do naturally because of the positions that we have or the jobs that we have. And so really trusting those and recognizing that those can be in us. And so the first one is to maintain healthy boundaries. You know, again, I want to go back to in tribal communities, sometimes we know the people coming through the door. And when they come through the door, we've had some sort of relationship with them outside of the work environment. And so we want to remember that when they come into our offices, there's a different relationship that's created, and maintaining those healthy boundaries is really a great way of being able to say, outside of here, this is what our relationship might look like, but inside, this is a professional relationship, and I'm going to maintain the boundaries of confidentiality and really honoring who you are as a participant. The next one is that TVR counselors need to respect themselves. You know, this is kind of that thinking of, what are you modeling for other people? And if we're struggling to have respect for who we are and what we do, then our participants, our clients can struggle with that as well. And so really finding respect for what you do and the tremendous job it is and the importance that it has in everything that helps the program to be the program. The third one is to recognize your role and responsibility in providing services. You know, our role as a TVR counselor isn't to take over and do something for someone else. It's really to be able to come alongside the journey and help that person to accomplish the goals and objectives they want to accomplish. And so remembering, this is my role, and these are the responsibilities I have in providing services. Someone in the beginning, when we asked the question, said, consistent services being provided makes an effective counselor. That's really our responsibility too, is to provide those consistent services so that people know that what we say we're going to do is what we're going to do. The next one on the list is to be flexible. There's many times when we have appointments with clients and something traditional happens in the community, or there's a death, or something, you know, happens that pulls clients away from appointments, or maybe they need to do traditional healing services for a period of time. And so an effective counselor is able to be flexible and able to understand when there's times that you give time to a participant and you allow the space they need to be able to take care of family things or community things. Another one is to make choices to grow personally and professionally. Now, this is where I really want to put a plug in for the TVR Institute with Laura and the great group that she has that facilitates that at Northwest Indian College. You know, as a TVR counselor, we've got to be growing professionally and personally. And if we're not doing that, then it's very difficult to provide the services the way that we need to. And so growing professionally is involving ourselves in even webinars like this, where maybe some of these things are just reminders for you, yet for others of you, this might be the first time you're hearing some of this. And so involvement in the classes that TVR Institute has, in the webinars that AIVRTTAC does, in just learning, being a lifelong learner. And then also growing personally. You know, sometimes there's challenges that we're dealing with, things that we're going through that we need to take care of ourselves so we can be effective counselors. You know, there's that old phrase that says, you know, if your gas tank is empty, you're not going to go anywhere. And that's really true for TVR counselors, is that when you drain yourself to empty, it's really difficult to keep going. The next one on the list talks about being authentic, sincere, honest, and kind. You know, authentic has to do with just being who you are, being your true self, your real self. I think a lot of times when people see us as, look, I'm a person too, and I don't get everything perfect, and, you know, being authentic, I think is very helpful for participants to realize they can be that way too. And then nothing can, you know, take the place of being sincere and honest and just kind. And so those are important factors. Now, the next one is important in a lot of different ways, but also we've got to be sensitive to this one, and that is to have a sense of humor. And I want to say it with this footnote. It's important that our humor is appropriate. Most people who come from certain tribal communities know what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate when it comes to humor. And it's important in the counseling setting to make sure that your humor doesn't cross any of those boundaries, any of those lines. And so sometimes humor can be used to lighten up a conversation when maybe it's gotten too intense and you just need a break or a moment to laugh about something. So humor can be very effective when we're working with other people. The next one on the list says that effective TVR counselors are willing to admit their mistakes. We're not perfect. We're going to get things wrong. We're going to forget to meet with someone. We're going to say that we would provide a service and, oh my goodness, I forgot to do that. We're going to make mistakes. And we all know that we interact best with people who can admit their mistakes. When someone acts like they're perfect, it is very difficult to be yourself around that person. So be willing to admit mistakes. There's nothing wrong with that. Appreciate the uniqueness of others. You know, we talked a little bit about that in cultural perspectives. You know, what makes that person sitting across from you unique? Well, it's because no one has the story they have. No one's gone through the trauma they've gone through. No one is dealing with these circumstances they're dealing with. And appreciating that uniqueness of that person is really an important part of working with them. Having a sincere interest in the success of others. I cannot say this one and really the last one, becoming deeply involved in your work. These two go together, in my opinion, because this is not just a job. I think someone, when we first started, said that an effective counselor has passion. There's a difference between this is my job and I'm passionate about what I do. Being passionate shows that sincere interest in the success of the people you're working with. Again, it doesn't mean you're doing the work for them, but it means you really want to see them succeed, and they know that. And then becoming deeply involved in your work, going above and beyond. You know, what additional services could be provided to this client? Can I research certain things and provide that information to a client? How can I become deeply involved in what I'm doing so it isn't just a 9-to-5 job, but it becomes something that's very near and dear to my heart? Laura, anything you want to add to that list?
You did kind of mention it under growing professionally and personally, but also I think it's important to be aware of what's going on with yourself. Like if you're having a hard time, to stop. If something's going on with a participant that particularly affects you, you know, personally in a way, maybe a trigger for you, to maybe take a little time to step back and try to process that, see what's going on. So also just being aware of your own emotional responses and doing what you need to do to care for yourself when that happens.
That's great. Great addition to what we've talked about.
Rebecca, this is Lee. Can you
Go
hear
ahead.
me?
Mm-hmm.
What I would like to share with the group that I believe it's also important as tribal members to seek help from our family members, our elders, so that our behavior within the professional work setting is in alignment with our tribal ways of helping people. It's also important to seek the help that's being talked about for your personal wellness, meaning we too need traditional healing to become balanced in the 4 domains that we talk about. And I believe it's also important to include our elders to remind us of the ways that we need to be observant about and be respectful about to continue our traditions as we bring in new folks into the tribal VR community.
That's great, Lee. Thank you so much for sharing that. Very critical. So we want to hear a little bit from all of you. And again, you can put your responses in the chat box, or you can unmute and share with us. And again, we just want to encourage you to make your responses brief. But what quality of those effective TVR traits do you find most challenging? Which are the most challenging for you? And let's go back, Ava, to the previous slide. Which of these do you find to be the most challenging for you? And again, you can put your responses in the chat box, or you can just unmute and let us know.
Good morning. This is Albert. I think one thing that I was looking at the list is the part that says that we're flexible. Sometimes, you know, we got to make sure who we are flexible with and who we need to be firm with, because sometimes a participant can take advantage of your flexibility and try to run with that. But once that's where I was saying earlier that it's a good idea to build a good rapport from the beginning and lay those boundaries and make sure that you both have an idea of what is expected from the counselor and the participant. So that's my response.
That's great. So we could say that an effective TVR counselor is flexible and also knows when to challenge a participant. So those two do go together. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to be transparent and share what might be challenging for you?
Hi, this is Elise from the Hopi tribe. I'm the Hopi Book Rehab Tech. I think what our challenges are having consistency, and that's the reason why I kind of put that in there. You know, each of the counselors that we had in the past, they had their own styles and their own, you know, ways of, you know, doing things. So now I'm starting to see, you know, the patterns of like, okay, this one did this and this one did that. But, you know, it just, I know each case is, you know, everything is on a case by case basis, but there's things that, you know, we're kind of more lenient than the others. So it's trying to get back the process of everybody moving forward and not being so lenient now.
Well said.
Carol is saying maintaining healthy boundaries and enforcing them. Says our office is by appointment only, and getting people to understand that is difficult.
Yeah, you know, you bend the boundary for one person, and then many people expect you to do that for everyone. And so it's difficult keeping those boundaries in place.
I think another aspect of the boundaries is kind of related to your last bullet there, becoming deeply involved. I think sometimes, I know in my own experience, I became too involved with people's cases, and that, you know, you really have to learn that you can't do that with everybody, and you really shouldn't do it with anybody, you know, like in a way where it starts to consume you. So learning about what your boundaries are and to learn how to maintain them it can be really challenging.
So what we really see is an interconnectedness of these traits, and that if you aren't utilizing them together, that any one of them can get you a little off track if you're not careful.
Hi, Rebecca, this is Julie Jefferson with Lummi Voc Rehab.
Hi, Julie.
I think, you know, like my thought is maintaining healthy boundaries. You know, we have 3 voc rehab programs, tribal voc rehab programs that service pretty much the same area in Whatcom County. And so establishing, you know, those healthy boundaries when it comes to sharing services, you know what I mean? And trying to figure out, you know, who the main counselor is working with the client, and being able to develop, you know, a relationship with all the other TVR programs that are providing services to our service area. And so in many ways, that's been kind of a challenge for me in regards to either me deciding to kind of step back and say, okay, you guys do what you have to do. If you need additional services, contact me. So I find it really difficult sometimes when you have TVR programs servicing, you know, the same area as you, and being able to maintain healthy boundaries.
Well, and really, as you talk, Julie, what I hear is how important communication is.
Yes.
To make sure that you're communicating regularly and about what's going on so that you can maintain those healthy boundaries.
Right.
Yeah, that's good.
Well,
I think
thank you.
I think that Ava said that Dana had raised his hand. Maybe not. Is there anything else in the chat box, Laura?
Yeah, I did raise my hand. I just, I'm sorry, this is Dana up here in Nome, Alaska. I just wanted to touch on what the last speaker was just saying, actually the last couple of speakers, about what is hard for us. I too find it very hard. Of course, you know, we're a small community. I was born and raised here. I know everyone. It's just so hard for me to remove myself from the knowledge that I do know about my participants. And so, yeah, I just have to agree with that. It's very hard trying to separate yourself. It's very hard trying to separate yourself from that, you know, from being Kudus Warnicki to being this office person or this person that can help you. I mean, I'm all about the help. I love helping. I just love helping all people. It doesn't matter from where. But yeah, that's all.
So that was really well said, and it did definitely connect to things that have been said, and it might be helpful for all of us to think about it from this perspective. You can't throw away everything you know about a person and just start with a blank slate, because you can't remove what you know. But what you can do is identify if what you know is going to help or what you know is going to hurt in the process. And if it's,
you know,
if it's something that is in the area of judgment or something that won't help, then sometimes we can make a choice to put that on the shelf and come from the perspective of what we do know.
What about the, you know, one thing I really have a hard time with, and I've talked with, you know, my director, my boss, and I imagine, you know, I will learn these tricks or these traits or whatever you want to call them during the process of becoming a voc rehab counselor, is that, you know, of course, with my own history, you know, I you know, got myself clean like 15 years ago, but I had a 30-year cocaine addiction. And so sometimes I find it very, and it's my own thinking. I think along the mentality of, you know, I had this addiction. No one was out there to help me. So I had to help myself. And I got, you know, I actually staged my own intervention with my family, but my family didn't care.
Wow.
I mean, they literally just did not give a shit whether I got clean or not. In fact, it was better for me to be drugged up because I was easily controlled or not controlled. Anyway, so what I'm leading to is knowing that, you know, I got myself clean all by myself with no help and everything, with no support. I sometimes find myself thinking, talking to participants in the back of my mind, you know, damn it, you just have this little problem, you know, why can't you do this when I was able to do it? You know, what the hell is your problem? I mean, I'm not saying this, but in the back of my
Yeah.
mind, that dialogue is going on. And
So
I
Dana,
think it's just human nature, but go ahead.
well, and Dana, as we move on, I think it's really important. What you're doing is you're talking about what you feel like are some of the hindrances or the biases that get in the way. And I think you're pointing out that a good VR counselor knows what those things are and is able to say, okay, I know that there's this voice in the back of my head that sometimes gets biased, or it begins to be, you know, a judger or whatever. And that's something I'm aware of. I think when we get concerned is when it's not there and we're doing it, but it's not there and we're not aware of it. So this one that talks about growing personally, I mean, that's so critical in what we do as VR counselors, because we've got to continue to grow personally and realize that everybody gets a fresh start. And really in our own journeys, it probably took 100 people saying the same thing before we got it. And so we're just a blip a lot of times on the journey for someone. And our role is to help them get from point A to B. Someone else might take them from B to C, but that's all we're there for, and to be present while we're doing that. So thank you, Dana, for sharing. I appreciate your honesty and openness with that. And as we move on and talk about some of the basic counseling skills, I think you're going to see that you have a lot of empathy, and that's one of the things that's really critical to learn in VR, tribal VR, any VR counseling. So thank you again. So we're gonna move on, and we're gonna talk about some basic counseling skills. These are definitely not everything. You will think of ones that should be on this list that we didn't include, but remember, this is a short webinar, and so they're not all here. This is just a start. We're going to actually unpack these a little bit and go into more detail. So right now, all I'm going to do is just go through them quickly, and then we're going to unpack and talk more extensively about them. So the first one is developing connection. And we've heard that as we've been having some discussion. We've heard how important rapport is and developing connection. The second is to show empathy, and we're going to talk about the difference between empathy and sympathy because they're very different. Recognizing verbal and nonverbal communication. How do we pay attention to the total message and not just what people are saying? Practicing active listening. This is where we're reflecting back what we're hearing and not adding our opinion to what is being said. Building trust is critical as a counseling skill. Even using silence and pauses, which are very difficult for some of us. We don't like the quiet. We want to fill it with conversation. And then finally, asking good questions. And we're going to talk about different question styles and types, and how and when we might use these. So let's start with the very first one and unpack it. We're going to talk about developing connection and what that includes.
Rebecca, can I just?
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
So Carol said ask open-ended questions, which is kind of the last bullet here, is ask good questions. Thank you, Carol. Victoria says, I feel like I struggle with maintaining healthy boundaries. I will respond to individuals when I am not on the clock, but during regular business hours, because I want them to know I am here and doing as much as possible to help them succeed. And then White Auto also says ask open-ended questions. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, thank you for, no, that's fine, because I can't see everything when you're on this end, you can't see everything. And so thank you, Laura, for sharing that. So again, let's unpack these and let's start with developing that connection. So Ava, if you want to go to the next slide. So developing connection includes some of these things. The first is to make sure that initial session honors the participant in their culture. Anybody could be sitting across from you at the moment of that initial session, and that person that's sitting there chose to be the participant. And so honoring that that participant was brave enough to come in and really honoring their culture, whatever that culture is, however they define that culture. Doing that helps to develop connection. Also learning from the participant throughout the counseling process. The biggest mistake we can make as TVR counselors is to think we know it all, or that we know more or know better than our participants. The truth is, we're going to learn as much from them as they're going to learn from going through the VR process and being in the program. And so being open to learn, and even learn about the things within yourself that you need to work on or change. The next one is connection is about communicating kindness and respect and concern so that that person feels like I have a voice and I'm seen and you're present with me. Also listening closely and paying attention. You know, people are telling us all kinds of things without saying a word. And if we aren't present and, you know, not thinking about the dinner we're going to make tonight or the meeting we have in an hour, if we pay attention and we listen closely, then we're going to gather a lot of information. And last, in developing connection is creating a positive professional relationship. You know, it goes back to, you may know some of the people sitting across from you in other kinds of relationships, but this is really where you let them know that you're coming from the perspective of a TVR counselor, and you're going to develop as positive a relationship with them as possible to help them achieve their goals. And that is really critical, that they know, look, this is how we might be outside of this setting, but in this setting, this is the way that, you know, I'm going to be to help you get to the goals that you want to achieve. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 2 of the skills at a time, and then we're going to ask you for your input. So with that said, we want to talk about empathy, because connection and empathy go together. And so Ava, if you'd go to the next slide, we're going to talk about what empathy means, some components of empathy, and then we're going to look at the difference between empathy and sympathy. So empathy is knowing a person from their internal frame of reference. I may know their behavior. I may have seen the way they've acted in other settings, but empathy means I get to know them from the inside out. And that's really important because it's their way of communicating who they are. Also, empathy means gaining some flavor of their moment-to-moment experiences. And what this means is I will never understand what some people have been through, but I can get an idea, a flavor of what they've been through when I let them share those experiences. And I'll give you an example. A little over a year ago, I was working with someone who was a quadriplegic. Now, I'm never going to be, at this point in my life, I'm not going to be able to understand that because I'm not a quadriplegic. And in order to understand some of his world, I had to be able to hear those moment-to-moment experiences so that I could gain a little bit of insight into what he went through. Empathy also means increasing connection. And this is where you as a VR counselor gain insight. The more empathetic that we can be, the more we can hear from our heart and feel from our heart, the more it gives us insight into what that person might need as they're working through the VR process. Empathy also means participating in the participant's healing journey. We're not there to force their healing. We're not there to decide how they heal. We're there to walk along beside them and participate in that healing journey. Empathy also increases the participant's comfort with self-disclosure. So the more that they know we are really feeling and we are hearing from our heart, the more likely they are to open us up and talk to us about what they need and what's going on in their world. Empathy also helps create trust that is needed to form a really important relationship. And empathy does not equal sympathy. So let's look at the next slide, because this really very quickly defines the difference between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy means I acknowledge that someone is distressed. So I might say something like, I'm sorry for your loss. So I'm acknowledging that they've gone through something. But empathy is deeper. Empathy is actually understanding how someone else is feeling. It's walking in their shoes or trying to walk in their shoes and really get a sense of how they're feeling and what they've gone through. Laura, do you want to add to either one of those skills, the connection or empathy, before we have a brief discussion?
One thing that came to me while you were talking about the empathy was that when you learn about what someone's disability or their disability condition is, how they experience it and what it's like for them, those are actually things that you can also use when you write your eligibility determinations, because you need to know what it's like for them and how it actually affects their life and their ability to do their activities, their daily activities. So
that's good. And it really points out that, you know, empathy and developing connection is about also gaining information that you can use when you do your job, so that you don't have to try to figure it out on your own or guess. It's really identifying the impediments and the needs and the things going on for that client. So thank you, Laura.
well, and you know, a lot of times there are things that don't come up with the official doctor's, you know, notes or what the findings in an assessment, that having how things affect them is really important.
Right. So true. So very briefly, because obviously, you know, we don't have tons of time, but how do you develop connection and show empathy to participants? And again, keeping your responses brief. You can enter in the chat box or you can unmute and share. But what are some things you do in addition to what was shared that might develop connection or show empathy?
From Uncle Sesame. I have many disabilities myself, from broken bones, arthritis through my neck and spine, head injury, PTSD, anxiety. I have many. And so when I have someone that comes in and I can tell that they're standoffish because they aren't sure how to be or feel or act about being here, I share some of that with them so that it relaxes them. And from where I came from growing up through now, there isn't an awful lot I haven't experienced. And that can come across too. And it builds the connection. It shows the empathy. And I let them know I'm in their corner. No matter what happens, I'm here to help them succeed. I want them to succeed. And when they succeed, I succeed.
That's really powerful. You know, you're talking about transparency, and when people hear that you not only are hearing them, but you understand from your personal experience, like that is powerful. That is so powerful to people. Anyone else?
This is Albert again. I think as a counselor, I've kind of looked at it as I got to be careful which one I look at a case with, sympathy or empathy, because if you look at a case with sympathy, it can cloud your judgment on a lot of services that you can offer and start making promises before you even go forward with the case. But with the empathy, you know, and understanding a person's barriers and limitations and staying within the parameters of the VR program, that will help you make the, you know, kind of like a better decision on how to serve that individual. So, but my answer to this is got to be careful which one you look at the case with, sympathy or empathy.
That was really good. Thank you for sharing that, Albert. Anybody in the chat, Laura?
Yes, Dana says, I usually share a little of my own history. Most people know me, but do not actually know me.
Right.
Hang on, it just went away. Let me get up there again. This softens the conversation. Heather said, I match their body language. This helps them see I am on their level, understanding where they are. I actively listen and provide support when they prompt me to. I never give them a tissue box while they're talking to me. I wait for them to ask for it. I was once told when you hand the participant the tissue box, you stop their train of thought.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's very powerful.
Yeah.
Thank you to everyone who is sharing.
There's more. Tricia
Okay.
said, empathy can be shown through non-verbal cues too, such as a warm smile, nodding our heads, looking at a person with kind eyes rather than a computer screen, offering a tissue, food, or bottled water, offering reassuring words of encouragement and comfort.
That's good.
Yeah, thank you, Tricia. Jonathan said, listen and respond to the uniqueness of your participant.
Mhm.
Carol said, I am always very transparent about our program, and I let them know that I will always advocate for the client. And Dana said, powerful, the tissue box.
So one of the things I want to point out, and we're going to move on to the next two skills, is that you all know this, you know, and a lot of times we just need to be reminded, but it's in us. You know, we step into the positions of VR counselor in a tribal community, and you sense, you know, what needs to happen. And so we just encourage you, be empowered by that, you know, that gut instinct of, you know, not giving the tissue box, those kinds of things. Those are very powerful ways that we can really show those skills and interact with clients in a very positive way. So let's move on. I know there's probably other things that we want to talk about, but just in terms of time, let's move on and let's talk specifically about recognizing verbal and nonverbal communication. And I want you to see this diagram that's on the screen right now and recognize that, you know, this represents the total message, but you'll see that words and tone of voice are very small pieces compared to body language and what's going on nonverbally. And so it's important for us to realize that we need to look at all of this as the total message. You know, I like to say it like this, that your words can say one thing, but everything else can be saying something else. You know, if my husband comes to me and he's in a very relaxed, you know, body language, and he says, I love you, I'm going to receive that way differently than if he comes and he's crossed his arms and he says to me, I love you. So words can be words, but they don't always send the whole message. And so it's really important that we look at the total package. And so let's talk about what some of those things are. So verbal is the message spoken, and nonverbal is everything else. Nonverbal includes facial expression, it includes posture or the way that we stand or move. It includes movements or gestures, you know, ushering people to come your way or putting a hand up where you're saying stop. It includes tone of voice. And really the distance or the space between people can also be nonverbal. It can be telling us something very powerful. You know, I think the reason we get into so much struggle with texting and emails is because we can't see the rest of the message. We're just getting the words. We're not getting the other pieces that we need to have. So nonverbal, verbal communication is an extremely important skill when it comes to being effective as a VR counselor. The next one I want to talk about is practicing active listening and how important this is and how it goes with communication. So active listening is really understanding what another person has communicated, really making sure you got that message. It's also participating in the active process. That means I'm present. And I said this earlier, but this is so critical. You know, I'm not thinking about the dinner I'm going to make or the event I'm going to or a meeting that I have, but I am in the moment with that person. I am active in the process of listening. I'm also responding to the total message, both the verbal and the nonverbal message, and I'm paying attention to the mental and emotional parts of the message, the words said, but also maybe what emotion I'm sensing and what's going on. And then I keep consistency in the messages to maintain a relationship. You know, what have I learned before about that client that I can bring in? What consistency can I bring in to the message to keep that relationship intact? And then, you know, practicing active listening is really critical in developing an appropriate plan for employment, that it helps me to hear the needs. It helps me to hear the services that might need to be provided. So I'm actively engaging in that process of listening with the client. This next slide will show you some pieces or some elements of the active listening process and kind of the progression or the way we can do this. And it talks about, number one, pay attention. Number two is the withholding of judgment. So judgment's probably going to be there, especially if we know someone, but we can tell judgment to sit on the shelf. We can tell judgment to take a seat, and we can really work to listen without judgment. And then reflecting. This is what I heard you say. Did I get this right? Clarifying with that person. The fifth is to summarize. So what I hear you saying is you don't have transportation. You know you're going to need that to get to different interviews, and you'd like to see if the program can help with that need. Did I get that correct? So summarizing and clarifying, and then continuing to share in that listening process. Laura, is there anything you want to add about, you know, verbal, nonverbal communication and active listening?
I don't think so.
So let's hear from you. How do you practice active listening and recognizing verbal and nonverbal communication when you work with participants? What are some things you do to stay present and to make sure you're hearing?
Dana in the chat says, on this note, when I am talking with a participant, I give them my complete and utter attention. If they are more comfortable sitting on the floor, as we as a people prefer sitting or sleeping on the floor, we sit on the floor. I lean in. It is all about the body language.
Thank you, Dana. Don't be shy. Anybody else want to jump in? All right, we will move on and talk about building trust. This is should probably be near the very top when we talk about a basic counseling skill. So in building trust, it's created when a participant believes that the TVR counselor will behave in a way that's beneficial to their life. You know, people can sit in front of us and they know the difference between this is just a job and I really want to hear what you're going through and see what I can do to help. So when someone knows that you really want to help and they can see that you're behaving in a way that will benefit them, that begins to build that trust because they sense and feel the empathy and the care for them. Building trust is also key to a participant accepting the TVR counselor's input. This kind of goes back to what Albert was saying, is that, you know, in understanding the difference between empathy and sympathy and when to use that, we also are there to provide input. And, you know, we don't have a right to speak into someone's life until they tell us we can do that. And so building that trust and building that connection means that that person is ready to hear you provide them information or even put challenges in front of them. Building trust allows disclosure. So when I trust someone, I'm more likely to tell them the deep things going on for me. If I don't trust, I'm not going to share. It also allows for change. I'm able then to talk about things I want to do differently or see happen differently in my life, or maybe something I want to take a risk at doing, or a job that I never thought I could do. And so building trust allows for that change. It also eases feelings like helplessness and powerlessness and hopelessness. It makes that participant feel like we're there to support them on their journey. So trust allows that person to feel that we're there to help, we're there to empower, and we're there to restore hope. And those are key components of building trust. Laura, anything you want to add to that?
The only thing I would say is I think another thing that helps build trust is when, you know, through informed choice, people are given choices.
Oh, that's
to choose from, so that they get to select what feels right for them.
That's huge. Most of us don't like it when we don't have choices. So that's really good. So let's talk about silence and pauses, and then we're going to hear from you all in your feelings about building trust and using silence and pauses. You know, a lot is happening when we're silent. And yet for most people, they don't like the uncomfortable feeling of silence. And yet when it comes to using this as a skill, it's very culturally appropriate. You know, in a lot of tribal communities, silence is really where a lot is being said, a lot is being pondered or thought about. And so it's important that we honor this based on the communities that we're serving. It also can provide for a transition, a shift in the communication. Sometimes you've talked about something for quite a while, and you can actually come to a place of pausing or being silent as a way to shift to the next topic or be able to talk about something different. It allows the participant to speak. You know, if we talk too much in counseling sessions, we aren't giving opportunity for the participant to share and to build the trust and the connection and to really talk about their needs and the services that they might see as being beneficial. So when we're quiet, when we're silent, when we pause, it gives space for that participant to speak. It also gives time to reflect on what's been said. You know, if you just keep talking, you go from one subject to another, but when you stop, then you pause, you think about it. And you really are able to take that in the way that we all need to do that at times. Silence and pauses can engage the participant, especially people that tend to not want to talk. The quieter you can get, sometimes it opens up that opportunity to engage the participant. And it allows for something called regrouping. Regrouping is when you come back to a certain focus, or you come up with, you know, you come back to what you were talking about and you come up with new ideas or a new direction. And so this is a very powerful skill that sometimes is uncomfortable to use. The last skill we want to talk about is asking good questions. And some of you put some responses in the chat box regarding this, and you're absolutely right. This is key to helping clients unpack what they need from the TVR program and what they need to really find and maintain employment. So when we talk about good questions, we're going to ask questions that might look a little bit different based on the information that we need. So if you'll go to the next slide, Ava, some of those questions include these areas. The first is open-ended questions. This is where many answers are possible. And when you're wanting to learn about that client or gain new information or get them to problem solve, open-ended questions are a great way to collect that information. And these are always end where the answer needs to be longer than a yes or no. So an example would be, what kinds of services do you feel you need? You're putting it out there in a way that opens the opportunity for them to share. Closed-ended questions are important at times, but they have a very simple answer, and it's usually a yes or no answer. So something like, do you need transportation? Most people would answer yes or no. So when we need critical information, we need it kind of quickly, we might use a closed-ended question. And then multiple choice questions have to do with when the counselor is giving choices. And the truth is there's times when we need to give choices because clients might want to pick something that's outside of the VR area. And so we might want to limit those choices to what we can do. So it might be, maybe you've been talking with a participant about counseling and getting into some counseling just to work on some of their own difficulties or struggles. So you might say to them, would you like to work with the Tribal Behavioral Health Program, or would you like to work with an outside counselor? So you're giving options within an area that you feel like you could provide a referral for or provide assistance for. So asking good questions are critical. Laura, was there anything you wanted to share about pausing and silence or asking good questions?
The only thing I was thinking is about the pausing and silence is sometimes it means ending the meeting for time for thought and rescheduling later, especially if you've been talking about perhaps directions to go or possibilities of vocational goals or things like that. And people really need the time to think about it or talk with their family or whatever. So it may not always be a silence in the meeting, but it could just be an end of the meeting. And
that's good. And I also want to tag on to that sometimes less is more. You know, sometimes we think more is more, so we keep going and if we inundate that person, give them way more information than they need. So sometimes, good point, that you come to the end of something and you end. It's just time to bring that to closure. It's good.
There are a couple things in the chat. Carol was responding back to Dana's comment about sitting on the floor. She said, I like the idea of sitting on the floor. Tricia said, I build trust by demonstrating consistency with my actions and words, communicating with my participants on a regular basis, and ask questions about non-VR topics, having a meaningful conversation about family, friends, and activities.
That's great. Thank you for sharing those, and thank you all for participating. So let's look at the discussion question on this one. And it really involves all three areas that we just talked about. So what do you do to build trust with participants? How can being silent, pausing, and asking good questions improve a VR counseling session? So take a minute to think about that, and then you can either respond in the chat or just unmute and share.
In the chat, Carmelita said, following through with tasks I say I'm going to do to build trust.
Okay, we totally should have that on our list. Follow through is critical.
Yeah.
If you don't follow through, people won't trust you. That's great.
Pat says, respect for consumer based on cultural values.
Yep.
Heather, the question was, what do you do to build trust with participants? And how can being silent, pausing, and asking good questions improve a VR counseling session? Letty said, follow up on participants. Claudia says, by encouraging my clients to play an active role in their cases, listening to their needs and goals.
You know, that's a really good point. And really one that we need to throw out there is, again, that we are not there to do the process for them. So the more that they can take ownership of their case and what they're doing in the process, the more likely they are to achieve their goals and objectives. If they think that we're the ones leading or pulling them, the more unlikely they are to get to the finish line, because they feel like it's our responsibility to get them there. And so really good point in what's been shared. So the last part of what we're going to talk about in the webinar, and again, we're going to barely scratch the surface of these because these could each be their own webinar and probably are somewhere out there. We're going to talk about some different types of counseling that can be used in the VR session. And really there are many types, but these are probably the most relevant to VR counseling and really make the most sense in what we do. And so let's talk about person-centered counseling, motivational interviewing, and cognitive behavioral therapy, and then finally family-centered therapy. So let's start with person-centered counseling. And Ava, if you'd advance the slide. So person-centered really means exactly what this picture shows, is that the client, everything that happens is centered around that person and what their experience is and what they're going through. So some of the techniques that are included in a person-centered counseling include the following. Listening. Now, we could all say that every counseling technique, every counseling type and model and theory includes all of these. But in person-centered, there's a lot of listening going on and not much talking. There's a lot of accepting. And so again, taking Mr. Judger or whoever it might be that sits there and tries to, be biased in the counseling session, setting it aside and being as accepting as possible. Respecting whatever that person is sharing, whatever they're going through, there's respect that's happening. And then understanding, coming, after listening and accepting and respecting and hearing, and there's a place of understanding from the person's perspective what they're going through. And then finally responding, but the response has to do with everything that they've shared about or talked about prior to the point that you respond. Laura, is there anything you want to add to person-centered techniques?
I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay.
There was a comment. I think it was back to building trust from Dana. I make sure that I follow through with whatever is requested or needed as soon as possible. I invite them to take an active role in their own life. I do point out that I am here for you. I only have this job because of you. You are the one person that is most important to me.
Well said. Really well said. And so in essence, that's a good, even in what you said, Dana, that's really showing that person-centered counseling technique.
Yes.
The next one we're going to look at is motivational interviewing. I think someone early on in the chat put MI, and that's just the abbreviation for motivational interviewing. And really, motivational interviewing is about empowering the participant to make changes. It's really focused on the participant seeing and discovering their own answers. And so this is where a lot of asking good questions comes into the picture. So let's look at some of what motivational interviewing includes. It includes expressing empathy and showing non-judgmental understanding. And so really the person doing motivational interviewing isn't doing a whole lot of talking other than asking questions and helping that individual come to their own conclusions. It also includes helping the participant explore gaps between current behavior and the life they want. So it isn't the VR counselor saying, hey, do you notice that you're not where you want to be? It's the participant through the course of answering their own questions saying, wow, this is where I am. That's where I want to be. I'm thinking to get there, I need to do these things. Motivational interviewing also includes avoiding arguments for change that would create resistance in the participant. So you're doing everything you can to stay in that neutral, unbiased space where change happens organically. And there's not a resistance from the participant because they're coming to the understanding of what needs to happen on their own. It's also accepting the reality of mixed feelings and inviting the participant to help with problem solving. So whenever we're on the edge of change, or we're highlighting, you know, a client is looking at things they want to do differently, there's mixed feelings. Because on one hand, you want to keep, especially when it comes to things like addictions, on one hand, these addictions have served a purpose. On the other hand, I don't really like what they do in my life. And so those mixed feelings, we accept that space and then invite that client or participant to problem solve. And lastly, it's supporting the participants' belief that they can change and achieve their goals. So this is where, you know, they look at how they do that and we become a cheerleader. We become a person that empowers them to be able to achieve their own goals. Laura, did you want to add anything to this?
The only thing I would add is that I think that this can be really helpful just to help people become more aware of why they do things and how what they do does affect where they're going in their life, which I think is useful for all of us to have those awarenesses. So that's just what I would add to this as well. It can be a really great tool.
Yeah, it's become very popular. And it's popular because it's really the person, the participant guiding the process, not so much the counselor. The third theory we're going to look at, or style we're going to look at, is cognitive behavioral, which is CBT counseling. And this has been around for a very, very long time. And it really looks at behaviors and thoughts and feelings and how they're all interconnected. And so when we look at some of the techniques included in this area, we look at some of the following things. So Ava, if you want to go ahead and advance the slide. What we're looking at in CBT is learning that what a client or a participant thinks about is going to create a feeling, which is going to lead to a behavior. And that can be things they're thinking about that are good. It could be things they're thinking about that are not so good. So just beginning to show and to expose that process. Another part of the process of CBT is identifying distorted thoughts that lead to negative feelings and behaviors. So we call it negative cognitions, where someone begins to think, I'll never get a job. I'll never be able to be employed. I could never do that. And they start distorted thought processing. And then that leads to negative feelings about themselves. And then that leads to the behavior of not even trying. CBT techniques include self-motivating of negative thoughts and self-monitoring of negative thoughts and self-talk. So really checking in, like how much of my day am I spending in negative thinking and also negative self-talk? and monitoring that. How much of my day am I building myself up? How much of my day am I tearing myself down? And then teaching the person to evaluate their beliefs and judgments and what they've been doing, and really testing to see if that's valid. You know, this is where some black and white thinking come in for clients who'll say, I'll never get it right, or I'm always going to be a failure. And really begin to help in that process of, do you have evidence for that? Is that valid that you're always going to fail? Like, have there been things you've been successful in doing in your life? And then teaching that thought stopping and reframing. So when they start the process of, I'm never going to measure up, I'm never going to get a job, this is never going to work for me, really helping them to learn, how do I stop that and reframe it as, it's really difficult right now for me to believe in myself. Those are two different ways of thinking. And then talking about the value of meditation and spiritual practices as it applies to the participant, and how those things can really have a calming, positive effect on the people that we're serving. Laura?
I don't really have anything to add to that. Thanks. There's another comment in the chat. Dana says, I allow the participant to just be themselves, be happy, be sad, be angry, be vulnerable. I give them that space. Then the possibilities, what is possible? Painting a picture of life could be with a little help. I want to empower them to be the best you.
Well, and really, you know, empowerment is such a powerful word. In a lot of ways, Laura and I want to empower you all to believe in your ability to do the things that sometimes you feel frustrated at doing, or you feel like you hit a brick wall. You know, with every brick wall, there's a way to get through it. Sometimes we have to take a step back and look at it a little differently, but there's always a way to get around it or through it. So empowerment is really critical of our participants, but also of ourselves and in what we're doing. The last counseling area that we're going to look at is family-centered counseling. And family-centered counseling is extremely important, really, in a lot of cultures, but in a lot of tribal cultures, this is really key. And so we want to look at some strategies or some specific characteristics of family-centered counseling. And so first, the participant is not just the person sitting in front of you, but it's the whole family unit. And that is really important to remember. For a lot of people, what their family thinks, what their family believes, who their family is, how they interact with their family, all of that is going to play into the VR process for them. And keeping that in mind is so important. And figuring out who needs to be at the table is important as well. The participant cannot be understood in isolation from the family, but rather as part of the family. That's another key part of family-centered counseling, because you will see that person sitting in front of you, but who they are in the community, the role they play in the culture, whether it's matriarchal or patriarchal when it comes to the community, all of those things are going to play a role. And it's very important to know, what does that family look like? And how does that person play a role or a part in that family? Families are systems of interconnectedness and interdependence. And what is really important in that is that if you have a client who wants a particular job, or they want to go pursue a career that their family is not comfortable with for a lot of cultural reasons, that system can fight the success for that person. And so it's very important to understand how might those decisions function in the family system. And that leads to each family member having that role or playing a role in the success of the participant. You know, if the father in that family and his opinion is extremely important, you might have a young person who's pursuing a career that the family or the father or whatever clan they're in, whatever cultural pieces there, that may not be something they want to happen. And so that participant may not become successful because that's going against something that has to do with their family values. And then services to the participant will frequently involve services to the family, and that may include you doing referrals. So there may be times when you're looking at what's going on and recognizing, wow, this involves the whole family. And that's where in Tribal VR, we can do services to groups, and we can provide certain things as long as they're, allowable. And then also do referrals. Sometimes you can do referrals for traditional healing, or you can do referrals for specific counseling or things like that in order to help the entire family. Anything you want to add, Laura?
I also wanted to add that sometimes the family may have a particular role in the community, a cultural role that may affect the employment direction or employment choices that a participant may have because of their responsibilities within the family.
Very true. So we've talked about these four. Any questions, comments that we might be able to hear, or your input about these counseling styles, techniques, theories?
And with these theories, they're not things that we're saying you have to do. They're just tools to consider. Things may come up with participants that you have, and you might be able to think, oh, that motivational interview might really, those techniques might be really helpful here with this person.
Yeah,
So.
and Laura brings a good point up, because you can also use a little bit of all of them,
Yes,
and based on who the person is and what is needed. So, well, I want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of your day and to be able to bring some information to you. Again, I don't think it's anything that you all didn't already know, but sometimes a reminder is really good for us. And if you remember at the beginning, I encouraged you to really complete that survey that's going to go out to you. This is really what helps us improve our training and technical assistance. And again, it's very similar to when you ask a client to provide a survey on your program. Like, it helps you get the input you need to provide better services. And so that's really true for AIVRTTAC too. So please take a few minutes and complete that survey when it comes to you.
Rebecca, this is Lee.
Go ahead.
I want to thank everyone for participating in today's very important and informative webinar. This is a reminder to all of you, your program staff, folks that you work with, that we will have a talking circle on this topic on Wednesday, September the 28th. The initial invite will go out on our AIVRTTAC weekly update this coming Friday. The time will be 10 to 11:30 Arizona time. We look forward to seeing you participate in the talking circle.